welcome to this explainer. You know, if you think Emily Bronte's classic, Wuthering Heights, is just some sweeping, tragic romance, well, you might want to buckle up. We're about to look at it in an entirely new and honestly, slightly terrifying light. Today, we're going to completely unpack how this story shattered a beloved Victorian genre, and we'll dig into the fierce psychological warnings that are hiding right there in the text.
Okay, let's actually kick things off with one of the most famous and arguably most deeply misunderstood declarations in all of literature. It's Catherine Earnshaw's desperate, heartbreaking cry, "I am Heathcliff." Now, usually, we're taught to read this as the ultimate expression of romantic devotion, right? Like, oh, they're soulmates. But our source material today reveals something much, much darker. This isn't a metaphor. It is a literal, terrifying statement of a fractured identity.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the classic Bildungsroman, its dark twin, the Negative Bildungsroman, how Wuthering Heights breaks all the rules, Catherine's fractured identity, and finally, a circular destruction.
Starting right in with Part 1, the classic Bildungsroman. Look, we have to understand the rules of the literary game before we can fully appreciate how brutally Wuthering Heights breaks them. So what is this genre exactly? Basically, the traditional Bildungsroman was a coming-of-age story heavily focused on linear growth and finding a nice, happy compromise within society. Picture characters like Jane Eyre or David Copperfield. They start out young, maybe they're a little rebellious, but through time and trials, they learn to temper those passions. They grow up, they fit in, and they usually get married as the ultimate symbol that, hey, I've successfully adapted to the adult world. As highlighted in the academic research we're exploring today, this genre was essentially the symbolic mascot for modernity and progress. It perfectly mirrored the optimism of the 19th century, this rock-solid belief that the future was bright, that individuals could consistently improve, and that human history was just this forward-moving current of progress. And it brilliantly illustrates the bourgeois morality of the era. It was a trade-off. To earn your comfortable place in the world, you had to accept a paradox. You needed enough individuality to be the hero of the book, sure, but ultimately, you had to renounce that rebellious spark. You had to actively restrain your passions to join the social contract, keeping the whole machinery of polite society running smoothly. But moving into Part 2, the Negative Bildungsroman. Because as the 19th century rolled on, that sunny optimism began to rot. Just look at this stark contrast. It is literally night and day. Authors started to distrust this neatly packaged idea of modern progress. So instead of linear growth and happy compromise, we get a degenerative narrative of complete failure. Protagonists in this new subgenre completely refuse to yield. They don't grow toward a happy ending. Instead, they experience what's called a circular deformation that ends in absolute tragedy, driven by their own destructive, unyielding passions.
So what makes a negative Bildungsroman? Well, it boils down to these four chaotic, rule-breaking ingredients. First, you have the intrusion of the Gothic. Think spooky settings, restless spirits, that kind of vibe. Second, a negative alterity, or a double, takes over the story. Third, instead of moving forward, the characters spin in a destructive circle. And finally, something called negative empathy, which makes us somehow connect with truly terrible people.
Which brings us to Part 3. Wuthering Heights breaks rules. Emily Brontë basically took the comforting rules of the coming-of-age story, threw them in the fireplace, and watched them burn.
We see Brontë reject these societal norms right out of the gate. Think about the gifts the children ask their father for. Young Catherine asks for a whip, a literal symbol of power and dominance. Meanwhile, her brother Hindley asks for a fiddle, a symbol of docility and politeness. Catherine is completely unorthodox. In a Victorian society that strictly demands little girls be sweet and submissive, Catherine actively seeks control. And while her father doesn't bring her a literal whip, he brings her a human one, Heathcliff, a dark, nameless orphan who essentially becomes the embodiment of her own masculine power.
If we track Catherine's trajectory, it's a tragic, forced slide from absolute freedom to being violently caged by polite society, completely ending any chance at linear growth. As kids, Catherine and Heathcliff roam the wild moors as equals, totally outside the rules. But then, while literally looking through the window at the civilized Thrushcross Grange, Catherine is bitten by a bulldog. She's pulled inside, separated from Heathcliff, and systematically reformed over 5 grueling weeks. It's like the world's worst finishing school. She gets stuffed into fine dresses and is entirely stripped of her wild autonomy.
This sets us up perfectly for Part 4, Catherine's fractured identity.
because once she is trapped at the Grange, her psychological profile just shatters.
In this society, to be a proper lady means to be entirely powerless. So her identity is violently split. Bronte's absolute genius here is making this mental fragmentation literal. Catherine's masculinity, her freedom, her agency to actually interact with the world, all of that was invested in Heathcliff. So when society forces her to reject him in order to marry the civilized, wealthy Edgar Linton, she isn't just dumping a childhood sweetheart. She is quite literally amputating half of her own soul.
Deprived of her true self and trapped in a shallow, performative marriage, Catherine descends into feverish madness. It gets so bad she tragically fails to even recognize her own reflection in the mirror. When she cries out, "Don't you see the face?" Chills, right? It's the horrifying realization that her identity has been so radically divided by what society expects of her that it's been destroyed. The wild girl of the moors is gone, replaced by a socially acceptable ghost who absolutely cannot survive in the gilded cage of the Grange.
And with her identity in pieces, we reach part 5, a circular destruction. Because when that linear path to maturity is completely blocked by oppression, the only place left to go is in a violent circle.
If you look at the structural binary oppositions here, you can see exactly why their story can't move forward. Thrushcross Grange represents everything the classic Victorian novel wants: civilization, submission, linear development. But Wuthering Heights, that represents the wild, unsanctioned reality of human passion. Catherine and Heathcliff simply cannot exist in the middle. So they destroy themselves. And worse, their cycle of vengeance literally repeats into the next generation. They spin endlessly, ending up exactly where they started, achieving nothing but total ruin.
Now, you might be wondering, why? Why on earth would an author force us to spend an entire explainer's worth of time with characters who are, quite frankly, so manipulative and self-destructive? Make no mistake, Catherine and Heathcliff do terrible things to the people around them.
The answer is that psychological trick we mentioned earlier, negative empathy. It's a powerful technique that warns us against emulating these characters by letting us safely experience the horrors of their mistakes. By forcing us to recognize something painfully familiar in their obsessive, vengeful suffering, Brontë lets us feel the catastrophic explosion of suppressed desires, but from a safe distance. We aren't rooting for their crimes. We are mourning the healthy, whole individuals they could have been if society hadn't forced them apart.
This idea echoes what proto-feminist Mary Wollstonecraft theorized perfectly. When a patriarchal society forcibly oppresses a person, their eventual reaction is bound to be unnaturally violent. Think about a bent bow recoiling. Catherine's terrible behavior, the manipulation, the tantrums, the self-harm, it isn't born from some intrinsic evil. It's the natural consequence of a society that denies women any direct masculine power. When you drill into someone that they must blindly obey authority, it's only natural that they're going to cunningly try to subvert it.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, Wuthering Heights leaves us with a pretty chilling, provocative reality to chew on. Do oppressive structures actually create polite citizens, or do they just create monsters? Emily Brontë took the comforting, optimistic coming-of-age story and used it as a weapon to show us the terrible cost of societal conformity. When we demand that people amputate parts of their identity just to fit in, we aren't civilizing them at all. We are just setting the stage for their eventual destructive recoil. It's a terrifying thought for sure, but an absolutely essential one. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll leave you with a challenge. Look around and ask yourself, what parts of our identities are we still being asked to leave out on the moors?